Okay, guys, I'm back. This is part 3 of the video lecture on the Second War of Independence, also known as the War of 1812, and the upsurge of nationalism. All right, so we're going to continue right off where we left off the last one. Well, actually, the next slide, what do we want to slide off? Okay, nationalism. Okay, nationalism actually increases after the War of 1812, as I said at the very end of part 2. Oh, I forgot to start my clock again. Let me start my clock. Okay, there we go. So now I can try to stay within that 10-minute range. Okay, so you have individuals like Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper. They become the nation's first writers. They actually use American scenes and American themes instead of relying a lot on the British culture and the British storylines that were often mixed in prior to the War of 1812. So they actually begin to write purely on American scenes that take place in America. Some fictional. You have the Last of the Mohegans. Fenimore Cooper writes, and of course Washington Irving. A lot of writings by Washington Irving. You have the National American Review, which becomes published in 1815. You have 1816, Congress revised the Bank of the United States. The national capital began to rise from its ashes of Washington, and they began to rebuild everything. And of course, kind of we learned from our past a little bit. We understood that we kind of did have to have an army to be ready to go to war. So we actually expand the army to about 10,000 men. So we have a standing army that's in place. At least, a expeditional force that's there. Uh, Later on, we institute the draft later on when we need to increase the forces even more. But we do have to have an army that's a standing army that's there at least to some size. And in 1815, with the naval, we have the naval victory in North Africa, and Stephen Decatur uh, becomes a naval war hero of 1812, and all the Barbary Coast expeditions. So the Navy actually begins. We build up our ships, larger ships instead of the small mosquito fleet that Jefferson had, um, to a larger Navy. Not a over. Well, I'm trying to think of a good word for that. Not a too large of a Navy, but a Navy nonetheless that had a presence, that had an American presence. And again, that pride in it too. Okay, so you have the tariff of 1860. Factories had mushroomed really large. Remember, I told you right after the War of 1812, and actually it begins during the War of 1812. We began to manufacture it a lot. We depend less on Great Britain. But British, after the War of 1812, tries a little trick. Remember, because of the Embargo Act and because of the War of 1812, they had all this surplus that's sitting there that they usually sold to us. And so the factories, we're not ordering from them after the War of 1812. We began to develop them in ourselves. So what Great Britain does is they begin to dump all their bulging warehouses onto the U.S. And what they do is they undercut the prices big time. Things that were being, yes, manufactured in the United States, but yet they were a little bit more expensive because of the fact that Great Britain has a surplus, so they're going to dump it, and they're going to dump it at really low prices. So by doing that, they're actually hurting America's factories, the war baby factories, as it's often referred to. And this becomes a problem for the United States, and the manufacturers begin to scream for Congress to do something because it's out of hand. They can't compete with this, and just Great Britain just kept dumping all this their warehouses onto all their products, manufactured products onto the Americans. So the Nationalist Congress, okay, because now it's not nationalism concept of the Great American. Uh, they passed their first tariff in American history with the tariff of 1816. Kind of reason you have to know the tariff of 1816, and it actually introduced a preliminary for protection, not revenue. So in other words, the tariff is designed to gather revenue for the United States, but actually it's a tariff on imports, so that uh, the British goods will be in comparisons. And if you really don't understand the concept of how tariffs works, basically, if you had something in America that cost $1 and the English were selling it for 50 cents, the tariff would have been added onto it say an additional, I don't know, we'll say additional $1.50 or so. So now the product from Great Britain actually costs more than what the American product is. So because they have to put this tariff or this tax on to the imported goods. So it kind of curtails that. But it does start a trend for more protective tariffs. And tariffs are always funny because tariffs can you can end up in a, especially if they're really oppressive to your outside forces, imports especially, that can create a tariff war between two countries. So tariffs can be they're kind of iffy things, depending on how, and not other countries use them as well, but and we still have tariffs today that are in existence. Okay, remember I told you about Henry Clay, kind of a guy that gets no real big recognition. But Henry Clay develops a plan for developing a profitable home market, and it has main three parts. But overall, it becomes known as the American system. The American system has three main parts. One, the strong banking system, which provides easy and abundant credit. That can backfire on us, which it does later. Number two is a protective tariff, which Eastern manufacturers would flourish because you're putting that protective tariff in place. And the third part is a network of roads and canals which knit the country together economically and politically. Now, number three becomes problematic because of the fact that, as I said, you remember that feeling of nationalism that takes place after the War of 1812. It begins to fall apart. And part of the reason that it does begin to fall apart is because a lot of the canals and a lot of the roads that are being built through tax dollars um, are being developed in the north, where the major manufacturing is, not in the agricultural south. And later on, when the South does declare secession or does secede from the Union, one of the grievances that leads to that is the fact that most of the money that's being spent um, is being profiting only the North, and so they're, in other words, they're seeing Congress passing laws that only benefit one section of the United States. At least that's the argument that the South makes. Now, that's not adding into the element of slavery or anything else, uh, but that does play a major part. So you have to remember the American system because it does play. The first part, the banking issue, it goes back and forth. It does for several years. Remember, that's Hamilton's baby. And the Jefferson doesn't really like it, but he does keep it. So the charter, gets renewed. And then, but with Jackson, it's going to become another issue, and we'll talk about that much later. And the protective tariff does work, and nobody's really argumentative about the tariff because it is helping Eastern manufacturing. Now, the southern states actually do have some of a problem with the protective tariff because they depended on a lot of manufacturing from England, which they felt, because, farmers, you buy things that's cheap, and so it was going to help them. Where they were being trapped for having to buy manufactured goods from the north instead of being able to get the best price from somewhere else. So they have a problem with really number two and number three. But number three is a big one because it really does play a major part into the concept or into the development of the Civil War. So, as I said, cause and effect. History is a series of dots, right? So, internal premise in 1817, Congress votes to distribute about $1.5 million for states for internal improvements. It ends up being vetoed by measure as unconstitutional for the fact that it was targeting various states over others, and states were being forced to move ahead with their own programs. So the Erie Canal, New York takes on in 1825. Benefits New York very tremendously, and New England strongly opposed federally constructed roads and canals uh, for the main part because they felt that it was going to pull away populations within. It would make people move more west. It would open up, the areas to the west, and then therefore would drain populations from them, and also create competing states beyond the mountains, which they'd have to compete with, and they would lose revenue. So they're not really supportive of the construction of roads and canals. As I said, the construction of those roads and canals do primarily happen in the north. And yes, it does have the effect that New England feared it was going to have. But if you're looking at the growth of a nation, you're looking at, well, overall, it's going to benefit us all. So they kind of had a narrow view on that. Remember, they just got burned with the Hartford Convention, too. Okay, so ushers in what becomes known as the era of good feelings. James Monroe becomes president in 1817. He's still part of that Virginia dynasty. Jefferson, Washington, well, wow, I had that wrong. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, uh, um, James Monroe, excuse me, Madison, excuse me, James Madison, and now James Monroe. So that was kind of became known as the Virginia dynasty. You had to come from Virginia to actually become a president to some degree. It is a period of a one-party rule. In other words, because remember the Federalists are dead, so you only have the Democratic Republicans that are still around, so that you have one party. And this is a good example of people will make the argument if parties are effective or they are not effective. Do we really need, one party? Would one party work if we didn't have one party? People make the argument if you didn't have parties, then everything would get done. But this is an era of becomes known the era. My time ran out. Era of good feeling. I can't get this thing shut off. I want this shut off. Okay. Anyway. Okay. The one party rule. The concept is the one party rule, is that you're going to see how this. It's known as the era of good feeling, but it's not. It's kind of a play on words. It's not really good. Era of good feelings. And we'll get into more of that in a little bit later. But the period of one party, it is known as the period of one party rule. Monroe, in 1817, does an inspection of military defenses and determines if additional militaries are needing. And the Boston newspaper is the one who coined the phrase of the era of good feelings. But like I said, it's somewhat of a very misleading phrase. There's several problems that take place, and I'm going to continue with this one right here, and I'll stop here. Problems during the era of good feelings is you have an increase in tariff. You have the bank issue that becomes problematic to a large degree because of the credits and everything. You have the internal improvements. Remember the constitutional issue about states not, about funding the improvement with internal states. You have sale of public lands, and the two big ones, sectionalism that begins to rise up and really become paramount during this time period, and also with the conflict over slavery again becomes paramount during this period and will continue to do so. Some of the other issues like tariff, the bank, and the internal improvements and sell public lands to some degree, that's an issue that the United States will deal with ongoing. The last two, sectionalism and the conflict over slavery, are issues that will end up, and we'll talk about a couple of these in this lecture, but become issues of which we try to compromise out. We try to keep pushing off to the back burner, so to speak, and hoping that somehow it's going to fix itself. But it doesn't. So, the whole idea of this conflict over slavery, this whole idea about sectionalism, again, as I said, here we are in 1817. You're already beginning to see the decay to somewhat of that great nationalism, unity of the United States. We're all one nation. We're rah rah, wave the flag. It doesn't last long because sectionalism becomes to play in a big part in the concept of what's good for my section of the country versus what's good for the country. And again, slavery, without a doubt, we're going to hear a lot about that all the way from now until we get through the Civil War. Okay, so I'm going to stop right here. I went over a little bit on this one, but you'll forgive me, right? I know you will. Sorry about that. And I'll be back with, what's it, part 4. Yeah, be right back.